Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture, Section 2.6, 16th Century Social Trends. The objective for today's lecture is to explain how economic and intellectual developments from 1450 to 1648 affected social norms and hierarchies, and the theme is going to be social organization and development. So first, I'd like to spend a couple minutes reviewing the important economic developments of the 15th and 16th centuries. These were topics that were covered in Unit 1, toward the second half of Unit 1, but they are very important, so it's worth doing a quick review here. So first of all, the most significant economic development was the age of exploration and how it led to the commercial revolution. The age of exploration introduced new trade routes to the Americas, Africa, and Asia from Europe, and it created a world economy dominated by Europeans. In addition, the commercial center of Europe shifted from the Mediterranean up north and west to the Atlantic, and also from southern Europe to northern Europe. Finally, it led to new economic systems like capitalism and mercantilism, and increased commerce, which is business, and wealth all across Europe. Another important economic development as a result of the commercial revolution were the changes in banking and finance that took place in early modern Europe. We see this first with the growth of a money economy, an economy based on cash for investment, for wages, and for the buying and selling of goods, so a cash-based money economy. This replaced the barter economy of the Middle Ages. This also included the expansion of banking, insurance, and various businesses. It included the emergence of joint stock companies. Now, these joint stock companies were big corporations where numerous investors bought stock or shares in the company, and then they received dividends or payments as a return on their investment from such ventures. An example of a big, valuable joint stock company was the Dutch East India Company, and the creation of these joint stock companies also led to the emergence of stock exchanges in places like London and Amsterdam. And speaking of London and Amsterdam, these cities became the new urban financial centers of Europe. London, Amsterdam, also the city of Antwerp, cities located on the Atlantic coast. And of course, this represents the economic shift away from Italy, more towards Northern Europe. Another important economic development was the emergence of a new economic elite. The growth of towns and commerce made merchants, businessmen, and bankers more powerful in some places than even the nobility who had owned land. And these merchants and other economic elite might even be able to purchase or receive titles of nobility, which would put them on an equal social status. This was especially common in the Netherlands, in England as well, and we can think of this as very similar to the emergence of the merchant class in Renaissance Italy. Basically, social mobility was now made possible by education and wealth. However, we have to remember that the vast majority of Europeans still did not have access to these things. Another important topic to note is the prevalence of subsistence farming. So in pre-industrial Europe, that's basically European history before the 19th century, so in pre-industrial Europe, most people lived in rural communities and made their living from agriculture. Actually, their lives did not change very much from the Middle Ages. The nobility continued to own the majority of land. Life continued to be centered around a manor or village, and peasants continued to farm the land and were still considered the lowest rung of the social order. Most peasants in the early modern Europe were part of a subsistence economy with subsistence agriculture. This means that they could only grow enough food to feed themselves and their families. However, the end of serfdom in Western Europe in the early modern period did allow for more mobility for peasants, so they could potentially own their own land or move to towns and cities. Another important economic development was the price revolution. The price revolution was the result of population growth and the influx of gold and silver from the Americas in the 16th century. This contributed to inflation or rising prices across Europe, but especially in Western Europe. So that meant that the price of food and other basic necessities increased with the rise of inflation. However, this also contributed to the growth of commerce in the 16th century. And while the price revolution made life difficult for ordinary people, merchants, businessmen, bankers, and landowners benefited. In fact, many members of this new economic elite looked for new opportunities for investment, which were frequently found in the agricultural countryside. And this leads us to another notable development, which is the commercialization of agriculture. So, the commercialization of agriculture was caused by the price revolution and changing demographics in Europe as some peasants began to move to urban areas. However, it's still important to note that the vast majority of peasants continued to live in the countryside. With the commercialization of agriculture, the rural economy began to shift towards commercial agriculture in the 1600s. So, what we mean by this is that commercial agriculture is agriculture for profit, not just subsistence. And new techniques and technology would support the gradual shift to commercial agriculture throughout the 17th and 18th centuries until we get to some significant improvements in agriculture right before the Industrial Revolution. And the final development of note is the gradual growth of cities. As commercial capitalism grew in the 16th and 17th centuries, population began to shift slowly from rural areas to urban areas. But again, we emphasize slowly. For example, in 1500, less than 6% of the European population lived in cities of 10,000 or more. But by 1650, more than 8% of the European population lived in cities of 10,000 or more. And during that time, we saw an overall population increase by more than 20 million. The Dutch, the English, and the French had cities that experienced the most growth in terms of economics and size. And this, of course, reflects the new economic center of Europe shifting over to the Atlantic. So let's look at some social topics now that were affected not only by those numerous economic developments, but also consider the major intellectual developments, which are all the developments we have learned about with the Protestant Reformation, right? The new ideas of religion and religious pluralism. So those intellectual developments refer to everything we've learned already about the Protestant Reformation. So the first topic we're going to look at is the regulating of public morals. So in early modern Europe, there was a change in moral authority. We can see this because during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church set rules on public morality. However, during the Reformation, this role of the Church was diminished or destroyed completely in many Protestant countries. And so we're going to see that new authorities will step in to regulate morality. This will also lead to the growth of cities and social dislocation. The growth of cities as a result of commercial capitalism and agriculture led to social dislocation, as people were either forced off their land or chose to move in search of new economic opportunity. And this actually led to new issues and concerns regarding public morality. All of a sudden, there was an increased need to monitor public morality, such as how should the cities manage the poor? Let's look at the management of the poor. Many cities, as a result of this social dislocation, saw an increase in urban poor. These were often wage earners whose wages did not keep up with the rising prices of food and other commodities. This also was seen by the increase of beggars on the roads in the countryside as well. Now, the Catholic Church and its monasteries had often cared for the poor during the Middle Ages, but the increasing number of poor in the early modern era strained the traditional systems of charity and social control. Therefore, the poor became the responsibility of city governments in the 16th centuries, especially since beggars were seen as threats to public order. Often, beggars were forcibly removed from towns or publicly whipped. And this also helps lead to a common theme in Western culture, which is this social bias that develops against the poor. This belief that the poor were deserving of their station because of a lack of morality or work ethic or something like that, but this attitude that people deserved to be poor. One thing that did continue, however, was the maintaining of strong religious influence. So even as new institutions began to regulate public morals, they maintained a strong religious influence, whether that was Catholic or Protestant. And new secular laws were created to regulate private life. Stricter codes were created to punish undesirable behaviors like prostitution and begging. And regulations in some cities even restricted or abolished celebrations. Again, this was most likely seen in some Protestant, especially Calvinist cities. That brings me to my next point here, that this type of environment was really common in the Protestant cities. The most obvious and famous being Geneva, Switzerland, where there was no separation between the Protestant Calvinist church and the city when it came to regulating moral behavior. This meant that clergy and laymen worked together as they were responsible for maintaining order and regulating public morals. This might require people to engage in a public confession of sins or public punishments, kind of like you see in the illustration here, banishment, and even excommunication. Now, one of the major factors that influenced this was Protestant culture, because Protestant culture emphasized a strong work ethic, strict morals, and modest behavior that was very common in Protestant culture. Let's now look at some changes and continuities that take place in the European family in early modern Europe. First of all, there were significant changes in the traditional culture of the family. Traditional culture in Europe began to change significantly in the mid-15th century and onwards. This was a result of social upheaval that came from the Protestant Reformation, natural disasters, and even the emerging capitalism. While family continued to be crucial to the preservation of the social order, the roles of men and women were changing within the nuclear family. The nuclear family, by the way, is the unit of a married couple and their children. This also demonstrates the decline of multi-generational households in Western Europe in favor of the nuclear family, which again is just the parents and their children. The way the family itself fit into a broader society also transformed during these years of change, as the family was becoming a new economic, social, and legal unit, but not without resistance based on age-old traditions. And just as we saw regulations on public morality, there will also be regulations on families. Family laws and customs were at the center of religious, cultural, and legal issues in the early modern period. Family remained the primary social and economic institution in Europe. Therefore, states and religious institutions were nervous about any attempts to change the order and the purpose of the family, but they still made frequent attempts to regulate it. For example, one continuation that was reinforced by authorities was the practice of primogeniture. Primogeniture was a tradition that continued from medieval Europe, and it was also regulated and enforced by the state and cities in the early modern era. Primogeniture was the tradition where the father passed land, wealth, and titles to the oldest son. This caused younger sons to become members of the clergy, or maybe join the military, or become artisans, which were workers in a skilled trade. After the Reformation, fewer men would seek lives within the clergy, especially the Catholic clergy, and this led to an increase in artisans that would eventually help fuel an emerging capitalistic structure in the cities of Europe. Another notable continuity is the continuation of patriarchalism, basically patriarchy, where the father was the head of the family unit and had complete economic and political control over his wife and children. And this was thought to reflect and also reinforce the relationship between a monarch and his subjects, and how a monarch had complete sovereignty over the subjects of the kingdom. Moving on to gender and class roles, family structure during the early modern period reflected the patriarchal structure of the larger social order. However, this patriarchy was probably more important in upper class families. For instance, the father had to make sure that the family's wealth stayed intact. And so merchants, business owners, and others who did non-physical labor frankly had more options in how to structure their lives than, say, poor people. And the only claim that a daughter would have to her parental estates would be her dowry, dowry, or the transfer of property or money that she would receive upon marriage. So the dowry was sort of like a gift that the bride's family gave the young couple to help them start their family and their lives. But husbands and wives of the class of people doing physical labor, so people like peasants, earned less money and therefore had fewer options. In these families, both the husband and wife needed to perform difficult and essential daily tasks just to survive. And so these poor rural households were run in a much more egalitarian fashion than, say, households in urban centers. And in these rural households, men and women engaged in different but often comparable tasks. But regardless of the family's class, location, or need to work, families in the early modern period functioned as economic units, with husbands and wives contributing with tasks that together accomplished the needed work. Another notable trend we see, especially a change that we will see in family structure, is families that started to have a later marriage age and ultimately fewer children. So later marriage age, smaller families. In the early modern period, couples married at an increasingly older age, and this is considered to be about 26 to 27 years old for men and maybe 24 to 25 years old for women. And this was because these men and women wanted to wait until they had either land or property or some ability to be financially stable. Also, the scarcity of food due to the price revolution and environmental issues like the Little Ice Age actually encouraged people to have smaller families. And if people got married at a later age, that usually led to smaller families. However, we have to remember that infant mortality was still very high in this period. 1 in 4 babies would usually die in infancy, and another 1 in 4 children died before puberty. So even though a woman would have on average, say, 4 pregnancies, she might only have 2 children live to adulthood. Now, the Protestant Reformation also had some notable effects on marriage and the family. Overall, Protestantism had a very different attitude towards marriage and the family. For example, in the Middle Ages, the Catholic clergy were seen as morally superior to the rest of society because of their sexual abstinence. And those who did not practice sexual abstinence, meaning the laity, were seen as weaker versions of humanity. However, Protestantism promoted marriage not just as acceptable, but actually preferable, especially as a means to control a sexual intercourse. And parenthood became honorable for religious leaders. So this meant that that Protestantism actually encouraged their clergy to marry and have families. Protestantism also placed family at the center of human life and placed emphasis on the, quote, mutual love between man and wife. So they encouraged a harmonious, happy family. Protestantism also reluctantly accepted divorce in some circumstances. Catholicism did not allow for divorce at all. Protestantism could, at times, accept divorce, but it was still seen sort of as socially unacceptable and undesirable. Let's take a closer look at the role of women in early modern Europe. Now, the ideal woman was a devoted mother who guided the spiritual well-being of her family, especially according to Protestants. This woman should demonstrate obedience to her husband, and also her most important duty was to bear children. And the role of mother and wife was really seen as a holy vocation, especially since the family was now considered to be the center of Christian life. Protestant reformers, actually encouraged women to take a more active role in religious activities and services within the home. They believed that women should receive a basic education. They actually encouraged women to read the Bible independently so that they could raise educated children who were good Christians and good citizens. Some Protestant women might even use their homes to teach the gospel and feed the hungry, or they might even take to writing, such as poems, theology, memoirs, and things that would support their role of wife and mother and their good, Protestant culture. Of all the Protestant groups, however, it was the Anabaptists that were the least patriarchal. Anabaptists actually allowed women to hold leadership positions within the church and act as preachers. But it was because of this stark contrast to the accepted practices of the time. This is why not only Anabaptists were largely targeted by other Protestants and Catholics, but also many Anabaptist women were martyred for their behavior. Now, there were no monastic orders for women in Protestant areas. So Protestants did not support monasticism, which meant that this removed the opportunity for women to become a nun. In fact, nuns in Protestant territories were often the last to accept the new Protestant religion. And as a result, there were now very few alternatives for women in Protestant regions. Really, family life was their only destiny. Also around this time, a social question emerged called the woman question, or the querelle des femmes, the debate of women. And this emerged in France in the 1530s, and it really was about this question of how much education should a woman receive? Were women even fit to attend universities? And along with this, was the male-dominated society maintaining an unchanged sanctified order, or was it oppressing women? So again, this was a debate that emerged with many of the changes that came with the Protestant Reformation. Now, one side argued that women were naturally inferior to men, and this was unchangeable. And they cited 3 reasons. 1, God created man first. 2, men were physically stronger. And 3, Eve ultimately deceived Adam and brought on humanity's downfall. However, the other side argued that men oppressed women to maintain their own social status and power. Eve was actually the one who was deceived, and a woman's inferior position was due to a lack of education and was therefore changeable. However, I think you can probably guess which one of these opinions tended to be more pervasive and dominant within society. That is why there continue to be many limitations on women in early modern Europe. Fundamentally, women were still subordinate to men. Women could not become religious leaders or hold positions of authority within any church, with maybe the exception of Anabaptism. Also, single women were expected to serve as models of obedience and Christian charity, and they were expected to stay quiet. Of the few female rulers of the period, we know that they were met with skepticism, derision, or even outright condemnation. For example, John Knox, the Protestant reformer of Scotland, condemned female rulers like Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth I of England. And so it's important to note that despite some of these small changes, overall, the Protestant Reformation did not noticeably transform women's subordinate place in society. That brings us to our next topic, which is cultural change and continuity in the early 16th century. So one continuity was the persistence of folk culture and tradition. Now this varied greatly throughout Europe, ranging from festivals that marked rites of passage like births and marriages, to feasts at specific time of the year such as harvest, saints' days, or religious holidays. And even though the Protestant Reformation brought religious upheaval, it also changed many traditions. Hoping to maintain their way of life, many people held tightly to folk ideas and customs, especially in Germany, where the Reformation began and where its effects were felt the most. Events like Carnival, which was this big celebration before Lent, and Saints' Days festivals continued to be popular even in some of these Protestant areas. However, there were also considerable challenges to culture from the Reformation and humanism. The success of the Reformation promoted the spread of humanism, with its increased emphasis on critical thinking rather than the acceptance of traditional beliefs. While people adapted many folk ideas and maintained them beyond the early modern period, the Reformation and humanism challenged other practices that would eventually become obsolete. However, certain forms of control and punishment survived from earlier times and were used by both local and church authorities. So there was some effort, especially from Protestants, to change some of this folk culture. Also worth noting is the role of education in the Reformation. So humanism became the basis for curricula in most secondary schools and universities. In fact, Protestant schools aimed to reach a wider audience because of the belief that everyone needed to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. However, I do want to mention that this still does not include women. However, the expansion of humanist education and the development of the printing press, both of these things together would lead to the spread of literacy in the 16th century, especially with the spread and the establishment of vernacular languages. Vernacular literature becomes much more common. For example, Luther's German dialect became the basis for the modern German language because of the Bible he translated into German had become very popular and widely printed in Central Europe. Now, one of the most interesting events that takes place as a result of the Protestant Reformation is the witchcraft craze that sweeps across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. So the Protestant Reformation actually led to an increase in witchcraft accusations and persecution. The many changes brought about by the religious and social upheaval of the Protestant Reformation is what contributed to these increased accusations of witchcraft, as many people became much more concerned about the influence of the devil and witches and evil spirits in their lives. Also, before Europeans used science to understand causes of illnesses, famines, and other misfortune, they often attributed such events to witchcraft. So this is before the scientific revolution and Europeans' ability to explain these things like illnesses, famines, and other misfortunes. Now, accusations of witchcraft likely peaked between 1580 and 1650. So this kind of coincides with a lot of the religious conflict that we're seeing at the time. And this also, of course, reflects the religious turmoil following the Reformation. In the 16th and 17th century, as many as 100,000 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, and about 40,000 were executed on the charge of practicing witchcraft. Of those, about 80% of those executed for witchcraft were women, many of them elderly women as well. Midwives, so women who specialized in pregnancy and birth, could also be accused of witchcraft if a couple in the village lost a pregnancy or an infant. And not only did women tend to most likely be the victims, women were also more likely to be the accusers of others for practicing witchcraft. However, the witchcraft craze was also strongly motivated and caused by the social and economic upheaval of the 16th and 17th centuries. Specifically, older women were often targeted if they might have been seeking charity or some type of, assistance. Accusations also came between members of poorer classes, so this is among peasants. And the economic change from an agricultural economy to a capitalistic one often created new tensions in villages. And so these witchcraft accusations also highlighted the breakup of the traditional village community and economy. These witchcraft accusations could also be motivated by social tension, social bias, social conflict as well. That was another big source of these accusations within villages. Now, the level of the witchcraft hysteria and the number of accusations varied significantly throughout Europe. Scotland, the German states, and Poland tended to see the highest number of witchcraft trials. In fact, about 3/4 of all the executions for witchcraft occurred in the Holy Roman Empire, which is the place that saw some of the most significant religious upheaval. The way of life in the Holy Roman Empire changed most quickly and most dramatically, so they had the strongest incentive to try to regain control over what was lost and lashed out at suspected witches. Another notable and unfortunate continuity is the anti-Semitism within Europe. Religious tension as a result of the Reformation led to an increase of anti-Semitism in some areas, and even the Catholic Counter-Reformation at times targeted Jewish communities. However, Martin Luther was actually the leader of this sort of resurgence of anti-Semitism. Martin Luther became increasingly anti-Semitic. This is because he had hoped that Jews would be interested in converting to his new interpretation of Christianity, and he became bitter and hostile when they didn't. One of Luther's most famous writings is actually a pamphlet called On the Jews and Their Lies. And I'm going to read you 2 quotes from that writing that demonstrates his anti-Semitism. The first one says, "Be on your guard against the Jews, knowing that wherever they have their synagogues, Nothing is found but a den of devils in which sheer self-glory, deceit, lies, and blasphemy, and the defaming of God and men are practiced most maliciously and veheming his eyes on them. And another quote says, "They are nothing but thieves and robbers, who daily eat no morsel and wear no thread of clothing which they have not stolen and pilfered from us by means of their accursed usury." Now, Luther's views and his anti-Semitism contributed to the emergence of modern anti-Semitism in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century, as Luther was viewed as this sort of nationalistic figure in German culture. And we definitely know what the consequences of that German anti-Semitism would be in the 20th century. However, as the wars of religion diminished in the 17th century, new ideas about religious toleration and religious pluralism and acceptance were extended to Jewish communities in some areas of Europe. For example, the Netherlands became a center for religious toleration that welcomed Jews into most of their cities. This brings me to our final topic, which is not so much about a trend as it is about a big notable event that would take place in the beginning of the Reformation. And this is called the German Peasants' War of 1525. Now, peasants in the Holy Roman Empire, specifically the German states, were really dissatisfied economically. There had been significant crop failures in 1523 and 1524. Serfdom was still practiced in many parts of Central Europe, and landlords continued to abuse peasants in some of these areas. So, inspired by Luther's religious revolt, peasants in the German states began to revolt against secular authorities. This meant that they rose up and they murdered landlords, they plundered monasteries, they refused to pay taxes, and they demanded the abolishment of serfdom. And this upheaval was primarily focused in central and southern Germany. Again, they were inspired by Luther's religious revolt, but actually interpreted it and applied it to secular authorities. Now, Luther condemned this rebellion. He vehemently condemned this rebellion, and it's because he needed the support of princes and nobles. He needed the support of that ruling class in order for his Reformation to succeed and spread, and also so that he could still maintain protection. So another one of his most famous pamphlets is titled "Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants," where he condemns the actions of the German Peasants' War. In this, he argues that, yes, freedom from the church is okay, but freedom from secular rulers and secular laws is not okay. Ultimately, this rebellion would be brutally crushed, and over 75,000 peasants would be killed. However, even though it seemed like a short-term failure, in the long run, conditions for some peasants did improve in the Holy Roman Empire in the following years, especially as we saw a continuation of the decline of serfdom. But this was yet another event that established the precedent that Lutheranism championed the power of the state over the church. Again, remember, that's a defining factor of Lutheranism, that it supports state over church. There's many reasons for this, and we can add the German Peasants' War as another reason. All right, thank you guys for listening to today's lecture. Don't forget to do your write-up and any other relevant work. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you for the next lecture.